Composition is something I think doesn't get talked about enough, but it is something that's very important. Composition is all about how you arrange the different elements in your drawing. So it's how you arrange line, shape, color, proportion, perspective, depth, texture, value, like all those different elements. It's kind of putting them together, compiling them to create this one piece, right? One cohesive piece. We're thinking about how the viewer experiences and interacts with our drawing, right? Or our painting or whatever we're working on. Sometimes the viewer is us. It's not meant for anyone else. And that's okay. But it's still good to think about our composition, how we're arranging that drawing. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. I want to start off by talking about him because when he drew that Vitruvian Man, that's considered like the golden ratio, right? It's the ideal proportions of the human body. In the Renaissance, they called it divine proportions, right? And what it is this like mathematical theory, right, that you can apply to art to make an aesthetically pleasing and balanced drawing. He did it with the Vitruvian Man, the human figure. The main point is thinking about this mathematical theory, right? So there is a way we can set up our drawing so it can feel soothing. It can be easy on the eyes. Is set it up in a successful way so it's easy to engage with. Easier for the viewer to engage with. Now, I want to say before we continue on that you can follow these tips and techniques and have a successful drawing, but you can also completely ignore them and still have a successful drawing, right? So take what is helpful, and it is completely okay to ignore the rest. So I just want to say that before we jump in. One of the first things to think about when it comes to composition is thinking about what our subject is going to be, right? And that may seem like an obvious one, right? Thinking about what exactly we want to draw. So let's say for this discussion, I'm going to be drawing my garden today. Thinking about my garden as a whole, that's going to be my subject. The next thing to think about after you figure out your subject is that composition, planning that composition. One thing that helps is thinking about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. So this may involve creating studies like I have in the drawing here, creating studies, figuring out a plan, ideas, thinking specifically about ideas, making notes. Sometimes this is something that can happen in your head. I know for a lot of people, they figure it out in their head what they want to do. For me, it helps me to draw these little studies and make notes so I can kind of see what I'm planning out. And that's helpful for me. However, makes sense to you is good. There's no wrong way to think through this process. Right. And so as you're planning your composition, thinking about that, one of the things to really pay attention to is creating a strong focal point. So thinking about something that will naturally draw the eye. So think about it as like, this is your main attraction. What do you want to stand out? And then what techniques are you going to use to make it stand out? So if I'm thinking about my garden, what do I want my main focus to be? Do I want it to be the garden path? Do I want it to be the bench? Maybe I want the sunflower to be my focus. So once I figure out what I want that main piece to be, let's say I'm focusing on that sunflower, then it's time to think about how do I make that sunflower my focus if I'm drawing my garden, right? And so one way to do that is to think about compositional maps. Some of these are used quite a bit. Some are not used as often, but these are just some examples of ways to lay out your drawing so it can kind of help draw your eye through that piece, right? Let's kind of walk through them together. So I have some actual paintings lined up with these different compositional maps so we can kind of visually see kind of these maps in action, right? So the rule of thirds is probably one of the most common compositional maps. It's one you see in a lot of work, right? And the rule of thirds, this is a Turner painting, I think the Fighting Timurrier, but it's laid out in the rule of thirds. And so what this means is that the subject, the important part, is in like 1/3 of the piece. And then like 2/3 of the piece is kind of open, right? And so here you can see the boat is right here. a lot of the action is happening in the bottom third. And so that's kind of, this is that grid, that compositional map laid out here. You can see they're even-ish squares. But you can see that if we lined this map up, compositional map up with this painting here, we'd see that most of that information is in that bottom third, right? And that tends to be like the rule of thirds is something we see often in art, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go through these maps as well. And it doesn't have to be exact, right? But thinking about these different maps really do kind of help us set up our drawing in a successful way. So rule of thirds is where that main subject is in 1/3 of the painting or drawing. And it can be any one of these thirds, like the left third, the bottom third, the right third, just in 1/3. And then you have that negative space, which we'll get into in just a moment for the rest of the painting. So in this middle painting here, this is a Van Gogh painting. I think it's called Fishing Boats. But this is an example of golden section. And golden section is, you can see, is very similar to the rule of thirds. But the big difference is that all the information is happening, like the main subject is happening in the intersecting lines here. And so we can see with his boats here, they're intersecting these two lines. That's where a lot of that information is. And then we see like a supporting character, I guess, a supporting role of boats in that other intersection. You can see it's not followed exactly, but it's laid out in this way. And there's something that really draws our eye in. We notice the main things we notice are the boats, right? And it's because it's set up in a way that is like follows the golden section that is aesthetically pleasing. The golden triangles is another common one, and this is a Fisher painting. But we can see that his figures in this painting, they line up with those intersecting lines. Golden triangle shows where those, where all the action, the main subject, is happening in these triangles here, right? And so we can see that the golden triangles, that's where those figures are. They're happening in main intersections, right? So Fisher set his painting up, so those figures are what's drawing our eyes. And like I said, we don't have to follow them exactly, but it is helpful to think about these different compositional maps when it comes to laying out our drawings, right, our paintings. And then here are some more just real life examples, or like painting examples for these different maps. That spiral section, we can see that in the Mondrian painting here. It's set up in a way that draws our eye to that center focus, right? All those squares, those sections are getting smaller and smaller to kind of bring us to that, the main subject. Here, when we look at that painting, we can see those squares leading us to that main subject, that big blue section. The golden spiral is very similar to that. We can see that happening here with Hokusai's print, The Great Wave, right? We can see that there's a lot of movement here in that piece, right? Starting from one side and spiraling into that main focus, right? That main subject. And even with this Caravaggio painting on the end, that one is the harmonious triangles. The big difference between harmonious triangles and the golden triangles is just that it's flipped. It's not important really to know these names, but you just kind of be aware of those different intersecting places and the ways we can line up our drawing so it makes sense to us, right? And it also is a way, again, of kind of guiding our eye through the painting or the drawing. This one, the cross, this one is another example of a compositional map, and we can see that in Manet's painting here. You can see that tree branch, it kind of separates that painting in half. And then we have that strong line across the top of that house that creates that cross. And so when we look at this, we're generally, because of that cross, that intersection, that's kind of what draws our eye in, right? And so just like these harmonious triangles, the rule of thirds that we talked about earlier, where those intersections are and where that eye is going to be drawn. And it's something, the cross is where you're centering something and it's becoming symmetrical. Focal mass is another compositional map that's really helpful. And we can see that in this Bisa Butler quilt. This one is the Safety Patrol, I think. But so the focal mass is all about high contrast. It doesn't mean just black and white, but it means thinking about sharp images and dull, like out of focus images. It's thinking of bright colors and dark colors, bold colors, faded colors, thinking about that high contrast. And so we can see with the Bisa Butler quilt here, that background is very muted. And that focal point is placed in the center here. But it's really bold colors, really dark colors. There's a lot of detail. And so that center is what draws us in. And that's that focal mass, right? Where everything's happening in that one space. And then another example is that V arrangement. And the example of that, the painting I have of that is a Van Gogh, his roses. But you can see where a lot of that information, that main subject, is inside that V shape, right? There's something that is like draws our eye about that, right? Draws our eye in to that image. And then just a few more examples, painting examples for this. The diagonal map is helpful when you're wanting to express like movement, right? And so we can see that. I think this is a Remington painting, the cowboy, but you can see like it's following that diagonal shape, and you can see it's starting at one point, and that horse's legs kind of follow it out. The body shape, the position of the body and the position of the horse kind of give movement, right? But you can see that diagonal shape or map coming through. We can see it kind of draws our eye in to that painting. When we look at radial, radial is different from that focal mass. Radial, an example of that is Hildegard von Bingen's illuminated illumination. And you can see that every part radial is where it's like perfect symmetry in every direction. Focal mass, that we talked about earlier, is high contrast. It's different. But radial is where there is like everything is exactly the same all the way around. And we can see that clearly with Hildegard's illustration here. But also if we look at things like mandalas, that's an example of radial, right? Thinking about those exactly symmetrical drawings. And then another one is the L arrangement. And I have another Van Gogh painting. I'm talking a lot about Van Gogh. Another Van Gogh painting, the Starry Night here. The L arrangement is also a really great one to help show movement, that L shape. You can see a lot happening with that tree and then that landscape, that bottom line. It creates movement, and it kind of gives you a direction, gives your eye direction to kind of follow through that painting. Another example is that compound curve. A compound curve is something that we typically see in landscape drawings or roads. And so the example I have here is a Wu painting. And you can see that road just kind of goes through. It's another way to kind of show motion and movement. But it gives our eye a path through this illustration, this drawing here. Pyramid is another compositional map. We can see that with Leonardo's Lady with an Ermine. This painting is kind of laid out in that pyramid shape. You can see her head is at the top, and it kind of goes down in that triangular shape. Another way to kind of guide our eye through that painting. And pyramid is something that was used a lot. This compositional map was something that was used a lot in the Renaissance. That was something like an easy way for people to set up their painting. And so you see a lot of the pyramid and a lot of those paintings and drawings for sure. And then the last one I have here is a Rembrandt painting, Parable of the Rich Man. This is a circular, an example of a circular map, right? Compositional map. There's art that's happening, like information that's happening in the whole piece, but that focus is in that circular shape here. You can see that's where the strong light is. The rest of it is kind of dark. So it's another way, like playing on light like that is another way to really draw our eye into this painting, this drawing. So there are a variety of compositional maps that are helpful right? It's not important that we know the names specifically, but what is important is thinking about how we're setting up our drawing to guide the viewer, whether it's us or someone else, to guide the viewer through our drawing, right? It's how we lay it out, right? And so we looked at several examples, kind of quickly went through several examples on these different compositional maps. Now, these are not the end all be all, like you have to do one of these maps. You have to follow through with your drawing in this way. But these are just some examples. These are a starting place and kind of get us thinking, hopefully get us thinking and how we want to lay out our drawing, because how it's positioned, how our drawing is positioned on the page is important, right? One of the things, another compositional thing to think about is positive and negative space. And as I mentioned earlier, like the idea of positive and negative immediately puts a certain thing in our mind, right? Positive, we think of good, negative, we think of bad, but that's not exactly the case when it comes to drawing. Positive is focused on the main focus, right? That's what that is. The negative space is basically that background. It's that supporting role. And so we can see here in these little drawings, this group of trees here in that landscape, this is that positive space. This is where our focus is, right? The trees in the landscape. That background is that supporting role. So it's that negative space. We can see in the other example on the other side here that the trees are much smaller, the landscape is much smaller, but that's still the positive space. There's more negative space, which causes like more tension in the drawing, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And I will say, like for a lot of my personal art, I like using just a little bit of positive space and a whole lot of negative space. I like that tension. So there's no wrong way you can make it even. Like here in this first drawing, we have the trees in the landscape, and that's about the same, it takes up about the same space as the negative space, that background, right? And a good example of that is Hokusai's print here, the Great Wave. We can see the negative space is that sky, that background, right? That supporting role. That positive space is where all that detail is, right? That's the focus, the Great Wave, right? Draws our eye right in here. And so that's kind of a simplified way of talking about positive and negative space. And again, positive is going to be that main focus, right? That negative space is that background, it's that supporting role. So again, like the Great Wave here, that positive space has all the detail. That's our main focus. That negative space is that background. Another thing to think about that can be helpful when laying out our composition is to think about scale. And this is a Magritte painting here that I think illustrates that beautifully. So the things that we notice are the giant head, right? And the tiny little people. There's like a little playing around a little bit with scale there, but it's one way to kind of draw our eye in, right? We notice the giant head, we notice the giant boulder. The little people are kind of fading into the background. We still notice them, but that focus is drawn to that face, right? The face in the rock. So playing with scale is another way to kind of draw our eye in and kind of guide it through our drawing, our painting. And then perspective, which we just spent some time talking about, 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, and then atmospheric perspective. These are things that can help guide the viewer through the drawing, right? Thinking about how we want to lay it out, thinking about the horizon line or our viewpoint or what our vantage point is in this drawing helps us kind of figure out what that focus is and kind of lay our drawing out in a way, again, that just kind of guides us through that drawing. So rule of odds, I don't know why it is this way. Somehow it has, like someone noticed that when there is a grouping of odd numbers, that's more aesthetically pleasing to people generally than even. And so you'll see a rule of odds, you'll see the rule of thirds, like threes are really important in art. And it's just like, it feels right. It's a smooth way of kind of guiding us through a drawing or a painting. It's not absolutely you have to do it this way because even just having even numbers of items like the 2 coffee cups here, it can be a good drawing. But generally thinking about things in odds are a way of guiding us through. So with these trees here, your eye kind of goes through that grouping of trees, right? It's kind of a small pyramid shape, right? Compositional map wise that we have here. And then cropping, going back to the apples, thinking about how zoomed in you want to be, how far out you want to be. If I want, like maybe I only want to notice this apple close up and I don't want the background. It's thinking about cropping, is thinking about what all you want to see. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. I could zoom it in, so all I was seeing is the stem of the apple, if that's what I want it to be. But it's good to think about how we're framing our piece. If any questions come up, again, always feel free to email us at our Contact That Matter email, or message us on our Facebook page. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. We'll see you soon.